It's really exciting for me to be able to introduce Stephen, partly because I've wanted very much to actually get a chance to talk to him more since the very first time I saw him give a talk on his research. I think it's your second year at SRCD. And I walked in because I saw, one of Susan Gellman's students giving a talk. Okay, I'll sit here and I'll see what's going on, and maybe I'll find out something about what she's working on. And I got a lot more than I bargained for. I think I found out something so unique and so interesting and so different from the other things that I'd seen in her lab. And I also found a very lively and engaged speaker, and I left feeling like I really learned something new. I think that so Stephen obviously studies concepts and the development of concepts in young children, so it's something we have in common, but he does something very unique with that. He's looking at children's concepts of race and social groups. He's also making an effort to connect that to the real world and to policy and to people's lives, and he's also making an effort to reach populations of children that we don't normally reach in our labs and in our studies, and I think that's one of the strongest contributions that he's made already in his very short but very illustrious career as a graduate student. So he's expecting his PhD. He's still a graduate student at the University of Michigan, expected 2017. He has a master's degree in developmental psychology from the University of Michigan, and also a bachelor's of science in applied psychology from NYU in 2012. And I was just thinking, wow, 2012, that's like I was full on teaching here when you were still an undergrad.
Excuse me.
He's published in very good journals, Psychological Science, Child Development, Cognitive Science, Journal of Cognition and Development. He has published on actually a range of topics in conceptual development, although his primary focus is on children's concepts of race, and in particular mixed race children's concepts of race. He's received already awards, fellowships, and grants in his young career. I like that there's a running total at the top of your CV. That makes it very easy for me. Running total of almost $200,000 worth of awards. He's interested in teaching at many levels and in mentorship, and he's already done some of that. And he's supervised undergraduate research, and some of you who are graduate students here know how tough that is to do while balancing your own work. So I'm very excited to hear Stephen come today to talk about children's concepts of race.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And when the first time we met at SRCD a while ago, I would have never thought that this would happen. So it's just been an amazing experience.
My brain work.
Good, and I'm glad that I can now kind of speak to a room of some faces that I've seen throughout the day. So I'm not speaking to strangers anymore. These are faces. So that's good on my comfort level. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about children's concepts of race. And broadly, I'm interested in how children think about social groups more generally. And if you think about the kinds of social groups that we have in our society, you can think of a range of social groups. So we have those on the basis of political party affiliation, gender, belief system or religious organizations, university affiliation, occupation, notice what the fireman's doing there, nationality, language, country of origin, and the list can go on and on and on and on. And as the list goes on, the picture from a developmental point of view becomes, I think, clear of, how do children make sense of all these social groups, and how do they learn about all these categories, and which categories are important, which ones are not, which categories license what kind of inferences, and under what circumstances can they make these inferences. So that's essentially what my research program looks at. How do children make sense of these social categories, these social groups? And I'm really interested in one social category in particular, and that's race. How do children think about this concept of race? And believe it or not, I remember the very first time in my life that the concept of race hit me. I was around 5 years old. That's me, in case you can't recognize. I was around 5 years old, and I was in our kitchen at the time, and my dad, black Guyanese guy, was talking to my mom, and he said, hey, when people see Stephen walking down the street, they're going to see him and they're going to say, hey, look at that black kid. My white German mom, on the other hand, she said, no, when people see Stephen down the street, they're going to say, look at him, look at that mixed kid. I can tell that from my point of view there as a little 5-year-old, that was a pretty confusing but also very informative experience. I learned that there's this thing called being black, there's this thing called being mixed. There'd be disagreement in terms of how people perceive me. Even my own parents couldn't agree. And I think that ever since then, I've kind of been thinking about this concept of race. And I'm not the only person who's been thinking about race. Our society thinks about it. We've been writing books about race for a very long time. We've been making movies about race for a very long time. And journalists are asking, is your baby racist? They want to know, how do these race concepts influence the minds of our children? I don't look at babies. I look at children around 4 years old. The idea is that, given the society we live in, how do we start to think and reason about these racial categories? Over the last few years, I've looked at this concept, how people think about race, from a variety of angles. So I've looked at how people think about multiracial individuals, and we found that how people think about what it means to be multiracial varies by age and between black and white children. It varies within multiracial children. That people use these concepts of race to predict multiracial friendship patterns, so they often believe that multiracials are more likely to affiliate with blacks than with whites. And we have some recent data looking at how these concepts of race, specifically multiracial individuals, entail stereotyping. So for instance, black adults, when they learn of a multiracial person who identifies as white, they stereotype that person as less competent, less intelligent. And white adults who learn of a multiracial person who identifies as black, they stereotype that person as less intelligent and less competent, so on and so forth. I have some work looking at people's concepts of racial stability. So does a person's race as a child, do they still maintain that race as a black child, for instance, grow up to be a black adult? And I found that that develops with age and as a function of a child's own race. And it's really shaped by language input. So how we phrase, if I ever block you, just let me know. No, just move all over it. That the language we use really shapes how children think about this concept of racial stability. Some stuff looking at concepts of group norms. And the idea is that once children learn that a group is characterized by a property, once they learn how a group is, they believe that individuals in that group should be a certain way. We found that that tendency holds in the US. We find that it holds in a Chinese sample in China as well, and that it's elicited under very, very minimal conditions, that it's really easy to get children to attend to group norms. And some other work looking at essentialism and social cognition, that this belief that categories have this underlying essence that grant them their identity, that predicts how children think about personalities. It predicts how adults categorize other people by race. And we have some recent work showing that it predicts people's political attitudes and voting behavior. I'm not going to focus on all of that today. I'm going to focus on a few of these studies today. And as I go over them, I want you to keep 3 key points in mind. If you take anything away from this talk, there are 3 key points. Okay? And the point 1 is that children categorize by race. Even though they don't really understand race, they don't have an adult-like understanding of race. And those categories can lead to very, very problematic judgments. Okay? So children categorize by race, even though they don't get it, and those categories can be problematic. And I also should have said that if anyone ever has any clarification questions at any point, feel free to stop me. Yeah.
What do you mean by get race?
By categories?
No, by get race. Because
They
I'm
don't-
not sure adults understand it either.
That's a great question. So yeah, children don't have an adult-like understanding of race. And I would agree that I don't even know what race is when you really strip it down. I also want to acknowledge some of the theoretical frameworks that you'll find that are implicit through all the studies that I'm going to present here, because I really rely on a variety of theories to kind of inform the work that I do. So obviously, psychological essentialism, this belief that children have really deep conceptual representations of categories, that they really think about these categories deeply. Social cognitive development, that understanding how the cognitive development of a child is really, you must understand the social experiences that they have, and that interplay between those two, you really can't understand one without understanding the other. Identity theory, you'll see that the categorizations people make really hinges upon their own identity and the own group membership that they are members of. And in line with social categorization theory, that even independent of someone's identity, that these categorizations we make are relatively automatic and just happen spontaneously. social dominance theory, that members of higher status groups show very different categorizations than members of lower status groups. Some evolutionary theory, you'll see that theme throughout. This fact that group norms and attention to groups, that serves an adaptive function for us. And it would be wrong of me to not mention ecological systems theory, and you'll see how these concepts vary both at really large macro levels between countries and cultures, but also at more proximal levels like a child's neighborhood or the experiences they have with intergroup contact. Okay, so I just wanted to emphasize those and show that all the research I'm showing really rests upon a long tradition of work. Okay, so the first line of work that I'm going to show you, children's categorizations of race, which really started off, was really motivated by this multiracial population, which is one of the fastest growing populations in the United States. Between 2000 and 2010, the multiracial population, so people who identify with multiple racial groups, increased by about 2 million, and it's been projected that around 2050, around 20 to 25% of the American population will identify with multiple racial categories. So this is a rapidly growing demographic group, but we don't really know much about them. We know a little bit in terms of how they self-identify. We know very little about how they're perceived and categorized by others, and we know very little about how they think about race themselves, okay? Now, before I get into the work on how these categorizations occur of multiracials, I think it's really important to situate the concepts of multiracials within the historical context. And this concept of hypodescent. So hypodescent is the process of categorizing someone with, let's say, white and black ancestry in accordance with their socially subordinate group, so as black. Now, around the 18th, 19th centuries, some states categorized people who had a black parent and a white parent. They categorized them as mulattoes, which literally meant mutts and hybrids. They would categorize them in accordance with this in-between category. And a lot of states, particularly southern states, they worried that having that in-between category would challenge the system of slavery. So if you have these people who are in the middle of free persons and enslaved persons, well, where do we draw the line of where slavery begins and where it ends? So they started to resist these mulatto categories, and they started to enforce these one-drop rules. And these one-drop rules meant that they varied between states. So Virginia, for instance, they enforced hypodescent, where they determined that anyone with a drop of black blood would be categorized as black. South Carolina, for instance, they often enforced hyperdescent, which is categorizing someone with their socially superior group. So anyone with any white ancestry would be categorized as white, and this varied between a whole bunch of states. So some states you had to be 1/8 black or 1/16 black, whatever that means. So these rules really varied from state to state. You can think that how that means that back then someone could have gone from, let's say, Virginia and been considered categorically black, go over to South Carolina and their racial category could change, showing how socially flexible and constructed these categories are. In 1920, the US Census, they enforced hypodescent nationally. So no matter where you were, if you had any trace of black ancestry, you were categorized as black. And that persisted until very recently, until 2000. Until 2000, if on the US Census you had any indication of black ancestry, you were categorized as black. Now, although hypodescent no longer persist at the national government level, that doesn't mean that it doesn't persist at the conceptual level and how we think about people. And as a prime example, you could think about our current president of the United States, Barack Obama. White mother, was raised by his white mother, but we often refer to him as the first black president of the United States. Why is that? Why do we categorize Obama as the first black president? Now, in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of work on that, looking at how adults categorize multiracials and why they enforce hypodescent. And they pretty much show that white adults who are politically conservative, who are high in social dominance orientation, who prefer group hierarchies, who feel that their resources are limited, and we have some data showing that those who are high in essentialism and anti-black attitudes, that they really enforce hypodescent. The idea is that these multiracials are a threat to diversity in their in-group status. There's been a lot less work looking at this from the perception of black participants, but we have one paper under review now showing that black participants high in pro-black attitudes are very likely to categorize multiracials as black. So both white adults and black adults have been shown to endorse hypodescent, but the key distinction here is that when white adults categorize someone in accordance with hypodescent, it's an act of excluding them from the in-group, and when black adults endorse hypodescent, it's an act of including them with the in-group. So same outcome, but very different process, okay? Okay, but the question is, well, when and how does this concept of hypodescent emerge? There's been no work on this with children at all. Okay, so there's some data, some research showing that white children, by virtue of holding a majority status in the United States, that they tend to overemphasize outgroup features. So the idea is that a white child lives in a predominantly white society. They don't very often see black people, for instance. When they do see a black person, those features, darker skin, different hair texture, stand out, and they tend to overweigh those minority features, okay? So in line with that reasoning, it predicted that, well, when we show white children multiracial faces now, they should overweigh those black features, or relatively darker skin tone, hair texture, and then categorize the person as black. But because children, unlike adults, don't have these deeply developed ideologies like conservatism or social dominance orientation, that when we show the parents of multiracial children, the kids will say, okay, this person has a white parent and a black parent. They're not necessarily more black or more white, okay? Black children provide a very interesting contrast because by virtue of being minorities in a majority white society, there's a lot of research suggesting that they don't differentially overweigh outgroup or in-group features, right? They have a lot of contact with white people and also a lot of contact with black people by virtue of their household. So they don't differentially overweigh in-group or out-group features. So under that reasoning, we predicted that, well, when we show them these multiracial faces, they won't necessarily say that this person is more black or more white. And similarly, because black children don't tend to have these deeply developed ideologies, when we show parents, that they would also not show a bias toward categorizing as more black than more white. Okay, so in this set of studies, we asked, well, do children, like adults in previous research, endorse hypodescent? Now, because hypodescent is so deeply embedded into our culture, one prediction is that everyone endorses hypodescent. It's learned. Or if children do rely on different kinds of information when forming these categories, then we should find very different categorical outcomes when we look at a child sample. And if, like according to social identity theory, someone's own in-group membership predicts how they think of these categories, we should find variation across white and black samples. Okay, so we randomly assigned children to one of two tasks, and I'll show you what they look like. There was a parent absent task, where half the kids were randomly assigned to this, where we introduced them to this task and we'd say, hey, today I'm gonna show you some girls, and your job is to tell me if each girl that I show you down here is the same as one of these three girls up here. And the three girls are this girl, and another girl hidden behind the red curtain. And they would never see any girl behind the red curtain, and we wanted to see if when they select this red curtain, we wanted to get at their concepts of race, and we didn't want to give them this perceptual matching strategy, okay? I'll show you what it looks like with the trials now. So then we'd show, for instance, look at this girl, where's the girl that's the same kind as this one? And most kids would go over here. Look at this girl, where's the girl that's the same kind as this one? And most kids would go here. And we were really interested in what they did with these multiracial kids. So look at this girl, where's the girl that's the same kind as this one? And the idea is that if they select the curtain, then they're saying that this child is not necessarily black or white, but there's something else. Whatever they thought was behind the curtain was irrelevant for the purposes of this task. We only wanted to see at what point are they saying they're not black or white. But if they go over here, that's consistent with the hypodescent pattern. And we predicted that white kids, for instance, by virtue of overemphasizing black features, that they would make this categorization, right? The other half of the kids, they were presented to this parent-present condition, where all the materials were exactly the same, with the exception that all the girls were shown with two parents. So we would say, here's a girl, here's her dad and mom. Can you point to the dad and mom? The parents would then fade out. And that's the same question, where's a girl that's the same kind as this one? And the idea is that if here they select the black image or say that she's black, well, that would be evidence for a really strong hypodescent bias because we just showed you that she has both a black and a white parent, right? We expected adults to show that pattern. Yeah.
Did you counterbalance which parent was it?
Yeah, so we counterbalanced everything you can imagine. The order of the response options, which parent was white, which parent was black, the order, everything you can imagine. Except the curtain was always in the middle. Okay. Okay, so what did we find? And I'm also going to say that across all the studies I'm going to show you, we had around 24 kids, at least 24 kids within each condition or cell, and all the data come from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I also want to say that my slides have been running since like 4 o'clock, so I don't know what my timing's way off. So if anyone just wants to flag me down at some point, just go for it. Okay, so here we're looking at how often children and adults selected the curtain. Okay, saying that these targets and multiracial girls are not necessarily black or white, and different colors denote different age groups. So for our white participants in the parent absent task, when they didn't see the parents, you see that they were all kind of bad at it. You can see that adults were no better than 4 to 6-year-olds in selecting this curtain, right? And they didn't necessarily believe that these participants were not black or white. But when we show them the parents, around 10 to 13 is when they kind of kicked in and they said, okay, these kids are not necessarily black or white, there's something else. Telling us that this concept of being multiracial might kick online around that age group. Yeah, Katie.
I'm sorry, maybe I missed this. If they don't select the curtain, does that mean that they're selecting the black face or the white face, or that's not?
No, that's a great question. And as soon as I'm done with these slides, I'll show you next. So hold that question, because the question is, well, what are they doing when they're not selecting the curtain, right? Yeah. Okay, black participants in the parent absent task, again, pretty bad at it in the absence of parentage. But when we show them the parents, it started to get a little kick online with age. And actually, we found that around 7 to 9 here with these black kids, it started to kick online, suggesting that racial minorities, which makes sense, theoretically, are more familiar with this racial minority category. But yeah, like Katie said, well, what were they doing when they were not selecting the curtain, okay? So long story short, created this different score where we just subtracted how often they selected white from black. So positive scores indicate a tendency toward black, negative scores a tendency toward white, okay? Red bars are the parent absent task, and blue bars are the parent present task. So with our white participants, see by the red bars, we overall find this tendency to go toward black, which is what we predicted, right? This overemphasizing of black features. And although it was a relatively small effect when we compared these values to chance, because if they were completely balanced across both black and white, their score should have flatlined across 0. Only our white adults still selected black in the presence of parentage information, which is that really strong tendency. You know, we just showed you that these kids have a black and a white parent, but they're still showing this slight tendency to categorize them as more black. Yeah.
I just have a clarification.
Yeah.
You referred to before to people as being bad on the task, and the way you're talking, you make it sound like they're right and wrong answers. That's not what you mean, is it?
Yeah, no, you're right. There's definitely no right and wrong way to perform this task, so I probably shouldn't have used that language. In terms of going against the hypodescent pattern, which is, you know, historically the stigmatizing way of categorizing multiracials. But yeah, from some people's point of view, that could be right. But yeah, obviously there's no right and wrong way to categorize people racially on this task. Okay, so with the black participants, first, with our adults, we found similar pattern. They categorize as more black than white, which is, again, that hypodescent pattern that we would expect all adults to show. But our black children showed very different responses. So they didn't show this tendency to go toward black at all, which is what we were thinking, that they would be more balanced across the two. But fascinatingly, we found that in the presence of parentage information, black 4 to 6-year-olds, when they saw the parents, that they tended to categorize the multiracial children as more white than black, which is the reverse of what we found with the black children. Completely unexpected. It could be that they're overemphasizing having a white parent. A few explanations that we thought of that we're still thinking through in testing and follow-up studies. But yeah, fascinating that within the same age groups, racial group membership really switched their responses. And I should also mention that all these kids were recruited in the same area. Yeah.
Did they have the option to choose the middle curtain, or no? They just forced choice, either black or white.
Yeah, on all these trials, we asked them to pick one of the 3.
So the curtain can be a choice.
The curtain was always a choice. So this is essentially when they were not selecting the curtain. Were they selecting the black image more or the white image more?
I'm curious how many people select the curtain.
Yeah, so the curtain was by far the most common response, especially with the older age groups. And this is just telling us, well, when they fell outside of that response option, how many fell on the other spectrum. Yeah.
So it's a different sample size per bar because this is the kids who didn't select the curtain?
Yeah, you're right. So across all of these are the sample sizes vary a bit from the age groups, but we do have I think they're around at least 14 to 15 within each sample. So the samples never got extremely tiny. But yeah, you're right. These are the ones who fell outside of that born. So we also gave parents this measure of intergroup contact. So we wanted to see, well, how many white kids is your child exposed to? How many black kids is your child exposed to? What are the racial demographics of your neighborhood? To see how their context really, if that related to children's responses. So long story short, we created this index of intergroup contact. How many white people were they around? How many black people were they around? This is my really crude attempt of trying to reenact a predominantly white setting. So we found that white children, the more white contact they had, the more likely they were to categorize multiracials as black, which is really consistent with the idea is that, the more you live in a majority society, the more salient these minority features become, right? And with black children, this is my crude attempt at trying to recreate a predominantly black context. For black children who lived in predominantly black context, the more black people they were around, the more likely they were to see multiracial people as black. So if you think about black kids in this context, more black contact, more likely to be black, so they were categorizing these multiracials in accordance with the majority of their environment, and white children were categorizing them in accordance with the minority, okay? Okay, so thinking back to this concept of hypodescent, these data kind of get at the idea how that concept develops with age, varies across participants' own racial group membership. That's a really complicated concept that depends on what kind of information are children given. It's a really complicated concept that has not received a lot of attention. Okay, so now, although children do indeed categorize by race to organize people into groups, I want to briefly show you that that doesn't mean that they have an adult-like concept of what race is. Okay, and these studies were really well. Before I say that, who recognizes this person? Okay, most people. So, quick recap: Rachel Dolezal, who, in my view, was one of the most fascinating people of last year. She has two white parents, identified as white as a child, identified as black as an adult. She was also the chair of a local NAACP chapter. She taught African American studies. And once the story broke that she identified as black, there was outrage. People were like, what's going on here? Clearly there's something wrong with Rachel, and there was national outcry. So these questions, this study now kind of gets at this question of, well, when do people believe that race is stable? When do people believe that race is fixed? Not is race in fact fixed or stable? That's a whole different question. But when do people believe that it is? And the study that I'm going to show you is really grounded in some work that Katie Kinsler did when she was at Chicago, where, and I hope I don't butcher this, but they would introduce children to a task like this, something like this. They'd say, look at this kid, and they'd hear this child now speak a certain language in English. There are 7 colors in the rainbow. Then they'd introduce them to an adult and say, look at this adult, and they would hear this person speak in another language. And then they would be shown a third adult and look at this adult, and they would hear this person speaking this language. And they'd ask kids this critical question, well, when this kid grows up, which grown-up will he be? Will he be this one or this one? And they found that black 5 to 6-year-olds, they made this race match, believing that the language would change, but the race would remain stable. And white 5 to 6-year-olds, they made this language match, saying that the language would remain stable, but the race would reverse, which was this fascinating finding. So when I looked at this paper, I thought, there's a lot of research showing how powerful language is. A lot of Katie's work shows how powerful language is, and that from a young age, children often, surprisingly believe that language is stable, that that can change. So the idea is that, well, if these white 5 to 6-year-olds believe that language is more stable than race, that doesn't necessarily mean that they think race is not stable, right? Maybe it's simply less stable than language, but maybe it's stable in general. So I thought, well, let's try to run the study again, but instead of pitting race against language, let's pit it against something that children clearly know is not stable, that changes all the time. Let's pit it against emotional expressions. Because emotional expressions are these powerful devices that children learn from a very young age. They're extremely salient. Kids know that someone with an anger expression is probably not very happy right now, or someone with a happy expression is probably having pleasant thoughts, and this kid is probably not having a great time. but they understand that these emotions are definitely constantly changing, okay? And I'd have an easier time arguing that whereas this kid's race remains stable across all these pictures, his emotions are constantly in flux. So the idea is that if children do in fact think that race is stable, they should certainly believe that it's more stable than emotional expressions, okay? So we ran a simple task, introduced children to something like this. We'd say, hey, here's a child, and here are two grown-ups. When this child grows up, which grown-up will he be? And you can see they can make a race match but different emotion, or a different emotion match and different race. And I'll also say that all these images that were pre-tested and confirmed to be perceived as categorically black or white emotion, happy or angry. And in this task, the emotions were always either happy or angry, and the race was always either white or black, okay? Okay, so what did we find? And we used these age groups to really compare them to the work that Katie had. Okay, so why 5 to 6-year-olds? There were a total of 8 trials, so hence the maximum score of 8. Red bars are the emotion matches, blue bars are the race-based matches. Okay, 5 to 6-year-olds were at chance. They did not necessarily think that race was more stable than emotion. Unlike white 9 to 10-year-olds, unlike Michigan undergrads, and unlike black 5 to 6-year-olds. Now what I want to emphasize is that keep in mind that same age group, but again, different racial group membership, completely different responses, right? Okay, so after this paper was submitted, and I thought about it and was thinking about, well, why were these white 5 to 6-year-olds not conceptualizing race as more stable than emotion? I thought, well, maybe they were thinking about these emotions in terms of traits or in terms of long-term disposition. So maybe they thought a mean kind of person grows up to be a mean kind of adult, and maybe they just weren't thinking of them as non-stable as I was. So I ran a second study, and the materials were exactly the same with one switch. When we introduced the kids, we would say, look, here's a child. This child's feeling happy right now. It's feeling happy right now. So we try to put in the moment, it's a feeling. And then here are 2 grown-ups. When this child grows up, which grown-up will it be? The reasoning was that emphasizing that these are feelings and in the moment, and the kids would be like, oh, okay, I get it. Clearly race is more stable than emotion. Did not find that with white 5 to 6-year-olds. All of a sudden they said that emotion was more stable than race. White 9 to 10-year-olds said that emotion was more stable than race. Yeah, it's not funny anymore. It's like, what's going on here? White adults, they still said that race was more stable. Our black 5 to 6-year-olds, all of a sudden they were at chance. They weren't sure what was going on anymore. And that's why we included a group of black 9 to 10-year-olds to see how they compared to the 5 to 6-year-olds, and they were at chance all of a sudden as well. These bars might look like they're going toward emotion, but statistically, they're actually at chance. Like, okay, well, what's going on here? So I thought, well, maybe, and this is in line with some of the work that's going on here, maybe the language that we use in introducing this task really shifted their attention, toward emotions. Simply labeling emotions got them to attend to that category. And if that was the case, then we should be able to label race and get to find the reverse pattern. So I ran another study, exact same materials, and this time we just made one little switch and said, here's a child, she has light skin, and here are 2 grown-ups. When this child grows up, which grown-up will she be? And you all know what's going to happen. They all chose race, showing that language played a key role. White 9 and 10-year-olds, white adults, and our black 5 to 6-year-olds, showing that the language we use really shaped the concepts that they formed and how they performed on this specific task. Now, just to get a quick overview of what it all looked like, with the white 5 to 6-year-olds, when we didn't emphasize emotions or race through our language, they were at chance. With the emotion cues, they went toward emotion. With our race cues, they went toward race. White 9 to 10-year-olds, in this neutral context, they reasoned that race was more stable, but they too were not immune to these verbal cues, suggesting that even at 9 to 10, that they don't necessarily have this firm belief that race is stable. Unlike Michigan undergrads, so like race is stable, race is stable, race is stable across all the tasks. Black 5 to 6-year-olds in this neutral task, race was more stable than emotion, but they too were not immune to these verbal cues. And again, I just can't emphasize this point enough, that within the same age group, different race group membership, very different responses, okay? Okay, so in thinking back to our good friend Rachel Dolezal and all the reactions people had when they learned that she she identified with a racial category that she wasn't assigned at birth, children might not think twice about that, and the belief that that's a problematic or a wrong thing is something that develops with age. Something that adults hold as intuitive and just objectively correct, that the race you're born with is the race you die with. Okay, so the first part, we looked at how children categorize by race. Second part, we showed that they have a relatively weak, non-adult-like concept of race. And the last study I want to show you is all about how this category of having a concept of a group can nonetheless lead to problematic judgments and inferences, okay? And as a quick background, so there's a lot of research showing how groups are both descriptive and prescriptive, okay? So descriptive in the sense that if I tell you about a group, you use that information to make inferences about individuals within that group. So if I tell you about a doctor, for instance, you'll probably think about the clothes they wear. They'll probably have a stethoscope. They give people, really large pills. They walk around with clipboards, so on and so forth. If I tell you about boys, for instance, you'll probably think about the clothes they wear, the toys they play with. And there's a lot of research showing how these, beliefs develop very early on, okay? But groups are also prescriptive. So not only do they tell us about the way groups are, but they tell us about the way people in a group should be. So if I tell you that a doctor, for instance, wears a hard hat and an orange coat to work, most people will think that there's something wrong with that because that's not the way doctors are supposed to be, right? And there's a lot of work showing that with gender, even young preschoolers, if you tell them that this boy likes to wear tiaras and wear lipstick, even though there's inherently nothing wrong with that, people think that that's a wrong, problematic thing, and that's not the way boys should be, okay? So there's a lot of work looking at why children make this descriptive to prescriptive tendency, or why adults do it. There's some work showing that it's related to moral concerns. Some things are just right and some things are wrong. It's related to in-group status. So it's not okay for people in my group to not conform to the group because my group needs to function, but it's okay for another group to violate their group norms. Socialization, if you think about gender, go to most of the bathrooms in this building. They're divided by men go here and women go here. And children get that information from a very young age, and they learn that certain behaviors are gendered. And there's some work showing that coalitional reasoning underlies these processes where if I think that different groups demarcate different teams or coalitions, that one must conform to the coalition that one belongs to. So the argument that I'm going to make is that even in the absence of all these factors, that normative reasoning in itself is enough to get children to shift from the descriptive to the prescriptive, okay? The belief that the way that a group is simply the way that it should be. And this research on normative reasoning, it's been around for a long time, but it's really boomed in the last about 10 years, showing that preschoolers, they quickly learn norms from others, okay, especially from adults. Even when there's no instruction telling them to do so, they pick up on them really quickly. And even after seeing a behavior occur once, so if a preschooler sees an adult model something, they immediately assume, well, that's the way that things are supposed to be done. Excuse me. The preschoolers often create and teach their own norms, and when someone violates a norm, they get really agitated, okay, and they protest, hey, you can't do that. Even when they know that the violation was an accident, that it was unintentional, and especially when they believe that the violation was freely chosen. Some work that's been done here. So the idea is that from a very early age, children are quick to pick up norms from others, they're quick to enforce norms, and they're quick to create their own norms. So norms play a really huge role in how they think about the social world. And recently, Tomasello has this great article in Child Development showing how this norm-based reasoning is really rooted in our evolutionary history, where if you think about a group setting, any group setting, that it's important to learn and pick up the norms and the rules of your group because that's important for the self, right? It gives you more opportunities to collaborate and work and learn with others. It's important for the group. It increases group cohesion and group morale and group functioning. And if you think about the person who, kind of strays off from the group and does their own thing, well, they're probably not going to make it back to the camp and they probably won't be around for long. So adhering to norms is very critical in our functioning. Okay, so the idea in these studies was, do children treat these group norms, these group regularities as prescriptive, even when the groups were novel, third person and engage in these morally neutral behaviors. And if sensitivity to these norms is indeed rooted in our group-based cognition, then they should have an issue with someone who violates these group norms. So to test that, we introduced children and adults to these characters here called the Hibbles and the Glurks. And we'd say, hey, I'm going to tell you about the Hibbles and the Glurks. We would then attach each group with a property. So for instance, Hibbles eat this kind of berry, and Glurks eat this kind of berry. And then we show them an individual and say, look, this Hibble is eating this kind of berry. Is that okay or not okay? And here you'll see a conforming individual, and they would also see non-conforming individuals when the person would do the behavior more typical of the other group. And we had a few behaviors. We had those that were food-based, those that were language-based, those that were games, and music. And we chose these properties because these are properties that people often associate with social groups. You can think of black or country music, boy toys, Chinese language, Indian food, so on and so forth. Okay, and there are a total of 8 trials, 8 conforming trials and 8 non-conforming trials. And I also want to say that in this sample, we didn't have any strong predictions in terms of racial group membership. So here the sample, I think it was around 70% white and about 30% racial minority of various backgrounds. Okay, so here when we showed them the characters who conform to the group and asked them, is it okay or not okay? Here you'll see how often they said that these behaviors were not okay. Okay, across these age groups, that rarely ever occurred. They were like, hey, that's pretty fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But when the person did not conform to the group, and we asked them, is this okay or not okay? 4 to 6-year-olds, they were very likely to say, hey, that's not okay, as were 7 to 9-year-olds and 10 to 13-year-olds. And adults were essentially fine with it. So a decline at each age group. The idea is that even when we show them these non-conforming individuals, even when the behaviors were morally neutral, they didn't know these groups, they weren't members of the groups, they had an issue when they went against the group. And also, these data are actually collapsed across the properties because there weren't any item or domain effects, so this is all collapsed across those items. And we also actually, very recently, we have a paper under review now where we replicated this pattern in a sample recruited in China and found a little variation, interesting variation that I'm not going to talk about now for time purposes, but wanted to just emphasize how this pattern does indeed replicate cross-culturally. Okay, so after these data were in, I thought, well, maybe the participants were simply reasoning that these groups were different coalitions, that these were different teams, and that, you know, it's, as I showed you earlier, it's wrong to go against the coalition you belong to. So we thought, well, maybe this coalitional reasoning predicted their responses. So we thought, okay, let's test that. And we ran another study where we randomly assigned kids to one of 2 groups, or one of 2 conditions. In one condition, we introduced them to the Hibbles and the Glurks, and we said, hey, look, these are the Hibbles and the Glurks. They're building towers today against each other to see who can build the largest tower, and only one group will win, and only one group will get a prize in the end. So we really beat them over the head with this notion of competition. And we'd ask them at the end, well, you know, how many groups are going to get a prize, or are there enough resources in the end? So all the kids got it, and then we'd move on. The other half of the kids, we randomly assigned them to a condition where we said, hey, I'm going to tell you about the Hibbles and the Glurks. Today they're building towers together with everyone. There are enough blocks for everyone, and everyone's going to get a prize in the end. We really wanted to get this sense of coordination and cooperation. And then we'd ask them similar questions. Are there enough blocks for everyone? Will everyone get a prize? And they all got it. And we moved on. And then in both conditions, they would see the exact same trials as in the first study. Okay, is this okay or not okay? So here you'll see it broken down by, within each age group, competition condition, cooperation condition. So when the character conformed to the group, how often did they say that it was not okay? Consistent with the previous study, that rarely ever happened. This was typically fine. But when we showed them a non-conforming individual, was this okay or not okay? Remember, the idea is that if they're thinking about coalitions and competition, we should find higher disapproval in that condition, which we did not find. So the rates of disapproval were parallel in both conditions. At the 4 to 6-year-old group, the 7 to 9-year-old group, the 10 to 13-year-old group, and even the adult group. You know, telling us that this descriptive to prescriptive tendency was really robust across intergroup contexts. It doesn't matter if these groups are competing or cooperating with one another. The idea is that if your group is marked by a property, then every individual within that group should be marked by that property. Okay, so after that, I thought, well, maybe another alternative explanation is that they simply engaged in some like perceptual matching strategy. Maybe they thought that orange characters must always do orange things and green characters must always do green things. Or maybe it wasn't about group norms per se, maybe it was just about norms in general, any norm. So we ran one more study where instead of groups this time, we showed them individuals, and we stripped off all reference to groups. We said, look, I'm going to tell you about these two, this one and this one. Look, this one eats this kind of berry, and this one eats this kind of berry, so we didn't want to make any reference to the group. Look at this one's eating this kind of berry, is that okay or not okay? And the idea is that if group-based reasoning really predicted their responses, well, once we strip all reference of the group away, now their disapproval should decline, okay? And in this study, we only looked at 4 to 6-year-olds because the reasoning was that since they showed the highest disapproval in the previous studies, if we can reduce it here, then there's no need on trying to recruit 10 to 13-year-olds. Okay, so when the character conformed to the group, remember in the first study, they rarely ever said that that was not okay, found the same pattern in this study. When the person did not conform to their group, in the first study, remember they often said that that was not okay, and that declined significantly in the second study, suggesting that once you take that emphasis off groups and emphasize individuality, that this disapproval against nonconformity declines. Now, at the end of every trial, we did ask kids, well, whenever they said something was okay or not okay, we asked them, well, why is it okay or why is it not okay? Those explanation data are a little complicated, but I did want to give you the broad themes of what kids were spontaneously appealing to when they justified their responses, because I thought they were fascinating and super informative, and who doesn't want to hear what a 4-year-old thinks about conformity? So when we show them these conforming individuals, and the kid said that it was okay, and the interviewer asked, well, why is it okay? This 6-year-old said, well, because it's a hibbleberry, and those are hibbleberries. And this 7-year-old said, well, that's what the others are doing. It is in his culture. And we didn't say anything about culture, so that was a huge inference to make. So they often appeal to the categorical membership, okay? Saying that it's okay because that's what the group does. When the character did not conform to the group, and kids said that it was not okay, and we asked, well, why is it not okay? This 10-year-old said, well, because that's not the language it's supposed to speak, that normative reasoning. And this 6-year-old said, well, they should only play with their own toy. Okay, so they often appeal to these rules and norms, getting at our reasoning that this really underlies their perceptions. And when they ever said that these behaviors were okay, and we asked them, well, why is it okay? And I think that's the world we all want to live in, where hibbles can eat whatever berries they want to eat. And we asked, well, why is that okay? This 6-year-old said, well, sometimes people just like different things. And this 7-year-old said, well, yeah, he just wants to speak and learn. And my favorite response, this 22-year-old undergrad said, because this is a free country, and hibbles can do whatever they want. Okay? So they often appeal to individuality, saying it's okay to go against the group because, individual expression. Okay, now, of course, we don't really care about the hibbles and the glerks. They're not real characters. I mean, I care about them, but I know you don't care about the hibbles and the glerks. We care about those real-world categories that people and children are very often exposed to. Okay, and the idea is that once children learn that a group is associated with a property, they very quickly assume that individuals within that group should be characterized by that property. I think that's a really powerful way to understand, how stereotypes and norm enforcement develops. That it's a very quick process. One process through which kids can probably reduce all that complexity that they're exposed to, right? One quick way to learn about individuals and interact with them is just learn what group they belong to, and now you can make all these inferences about them. So back to that journal I showed in the beginning of Is Your Baby Racist? I hope I kind of showed you that's a really complicated question that doesn't have a straightforward answer. Although children may categorize by race, that doesn't mean that they don't have an adult-like understanding of race. But those categories, those concepts of those categories can nonetheless lead to some problematic judgments. Okay, so in some of the current and future work I'm doing, moving beyond this concept of thinking that people are either black or white. So we have some work showing that when adults think of a multiracial person, for instance, they don't necessarily think that this person is black or white, but they could think that this person can shift between those identities, or that these identities are contextually primed, contextually related. And I want to see, at what point do children start to think about race in these more fluid and complicated ways? How do multiracial children think about race? We have we have a paper on this, but I really want to look at what multiracial children think about racial stability. So if you think that a multiracial child who has so much exposure to racial diversity, they might think about race very early on and very quickly at a young age believe that race is stable. But on the other hand, by virtue of having two parents of two different racial groups, they could say, well, I can grow up to look like this parent and like this parent. So they might not think that race is stable at all. So they really provide these two competing predictions. I want to see how core group norms are to children's social cognition. So we have some work looking at, well, how central, how important are these group norms? And I have some preliminary data showing that children prefer group norms over conventional norms, for instance. So if your group is known for raising your foot in your classroom to ask a question, children prefer that all individuals within that group raise their foot to ask a question. So group norms are more important than conventional norms. But I also have data showing that group norms are not more important than moral norms. For instance, if your group is known for hurting people, then it's not okay for you to also hurt people, right? So concept of morality can really switch around how we think about groups. And I'm also interested in contextual variation and individual differences. I alluded to this earlier of how this descriptive to prescriptive tendency varies, replicates but also varies between a US and a Chinese sample. And we do have some data looking at how parents' own attitudes, how they value authoritarianism, for instance, or their own preference for conformity, looking at how that predicts their own children's preferences for conformity. So I mentioned that I've been looking at these and other questions throughout my research, and although I didn't talk about it all today, I'm more than happy to talk about it at any point or during the remaining meetings that I have. I'm going to end on that note after I thank all my collaborators, everyone who supported this research, very important. My undergrads, who without them none of this would have happened, and everyone who's given me helpful feedback. I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback as well, and I hope I did not go over time by too much.
Not at all.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Questions? Would you like to? You can go ahead and.
Whatever the process is. Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, question. If I ask you if you're grumpy or you're black, it sounds like a funny question, doesn't it? What I'm concerned of, or if I ask you, are you black, white, or unknown, that sounds like a funny question too. My concern about the early experiments is that I'm wondering about the extent to which the results reflect the demand characteristics of people trying to figure out what you're really asking. Because the tasks seem, you're taking a really complex topic and you're doing very tight but a little bit contrived experiments. And so is there any chance that some of what you're getting is more like sometimes happened to Piaget, and that is you're getting people's understanding of what you're asking rather than fundamental categorizations of people?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And normally when I present these individual studies, I'll kind of show some of the pre-testing or pre-measures that went into it. So for instance, on the multiracial task with the curtain, there was actually a few questions before then where we asked them to categorize animals, also in accordance with this curtain. And there the kids were perfectly fine they had no issue in this animal domain. Once we switched over to the social racial domain, we found switches in how they responded. So that kind of tells us that they're not necessarily that task was not necessarily about task demands. It's about something specific about race and not the task itself, right? And then the same thing with the emotion studies. At first, we asked them to categorize different silhouettes of different colors. And when the task was about color, they would match by that. When it was about shape, they would match by that. But once we then went over into the race and emotion task, that's when we found changes. So when the task was the same, but the domain was different, the responses changed, telling us that it's about the domain and not necessarily about the task.
Although the concept naturalness may be different, because it's an unnatural task, I think, to ask if someone's black or grumpy. But if you're talking about animals and shapes, those seem like natural comparative categories.
That those would be more natural than race and gender.
Well, no, the comparison of race to grumpiness or the comparison of race to unknown when you're actually seeing the people. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. But isn't it fascinating that although selected grumpiness or race, that depending on the task and the language and depending on the age group and race, that they would systematically choose either grumpy or race? So the task demand wouldn't explain all that variation we would find across the age groups and racial.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that it could be that they interpret the demand characteristics of the task differently at different ages.
That's a good point. Maybe I don't know if this gets at your point, but we also had another study that I didn't talk about where we pitted emotion against gender to see what would happen here. And here, kids repeatedly would select gender over emotional expressions. But yeah, different kids of different age groups could predict different task demands. And I guess, unfortunately, I don't have any way of looking at that. But that's a good point.
Katie,
So I wanted to ask a question, raise an idea about kids thinking, or adults even thinking about hyperdescent, and see if you think that I could be right or it's wrong. I might be wrong. So I've been working with, I think you might know Sarah Gaither, who was my postdoc and is now at Duke, on some questions about people's thinking about what people talk about as hypodescent. And our question is whether, is it, people talk a lot about this idea of going to the lower status or the minority category or the one drop rule. And I guess I'm wondering, could it be actually a lot of the past data, but explained by more of an out-group over-exclusion rule? So the idea that you draw the circle, the criterion for membership in your in-group pretty tight. So in that sense, if you're white and you see somebody's ambiguous race, you categorize them as black. If you're black and you see somebody's ambiguous race, you're going to be relatively more likely to categorize them as white than somebody who's white. And so could that be right? Or do you think, and could that explain a lot of existing data in the field? Or no?
I think so, but if we look at the data from the black adults, that would then be a case of in-group over inclusion instead of exclusion.
Black adults.
They also categorize.
Exactly like white adults.
Yeah, so they're also categorizing them as more black. So if it were about in-group exclusion, we would expect them to categorize them as white, which surprisingly is what the black 4 to 6-year-olds did, right? So the idea.
So I guess in our studies, we find that black adults are more likely to categorize the ambiguous race as white than are the white adults, but maybe this could also, but that's not what you,
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting at all that my data are more truthful in the world or anything, no.
Yeah, no, and I think actually, Sarah and I think we spoke about those data at one point. They would be the opposite of what we found, but I think that's completely fine because I think is this sample from Chicago?
So this is what I was wondering, actually, maybe it's also about the participants' own, if we're right, it could also be about the participants' own identification with their racial group or the degree of positive identity perhaps that they have with their racial group, something like that. And so maybe when we test adults in Chicago, they're more highly identified with their racial group, and so something like that than adults in Minnesota.
Yeah, so on the one hand, just in terms of the exclusion thing, I think that, I would predict that for children that they're operating from an exclusion-inclusion framework because they're just focusing on features. But by the time they're adults, they may have learned the concept of hypodescent and that both white and black adults would endorse it. But sure, I would definitely expect that there would be variation across contexts. And we do have this nationally representative sample where we looked at across 50 states at adults' endorsements of hypodescent. And that people in southern states, they're especially likely to endorse hypodescent because that's essentially where the concept took root. Whereas those in northern states, in the Midwest, they're much less likely to endorse hypodescent. So there should be contextual variation. That's why I'm not upset by those data. That's actually, I think, great and amazing.
No, I think that's a really interesting potential developmental story that you just laid out. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Steve, did you have a point?
Yeah, I was thinking about the stability stuff you did, and I don't have in my head exactly, what they were asked to do and sort of what they, in the sense that you were mentioning about what they thought the task was. But is there any way to know whether those young white kids actually thought race could change?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, we could have.
I mean, we're talking about stability. And you know, when they're given the choice of you know, who is this going to grow up to, who is this kid going to grow up to be, they let's say pick sometimes the same emotion and sometimes the same race.
Yeah.
But does that, if they pick emotion, do they mean really that they think race can change?
Yeah, exactly. Which is kind of ironic, right? Because we set out to test, you know, the racial stability concepts, but actually at the end of the day, the data still don't precisely get at that. So maybe a better way would have been to, you know, show them Rachel Dolezal, for instance, and say, you know, do you think that's possible? What do you think about that? Is that fine? And see if they're permitting of people who have been portrayed as portraying their race. That would have been a better way of testing it. So we don't know. I mean, we'd also ran another task where instead of emotion as a contrast group, we showed them hats so they could match on the basis of race or a hat color. And we found that even their white 5 to 6-year-olds were still not saying that race was stable. So it could be that 1, they really don't think that race is stable, or 2, race is just not a very salient category to them, and once you give them any kind of other information, it kind of throws them off. Not sure. But the data do show that their concept of racial stability is relatively weak, and it's definitely not, I would argue, not present, because if it was, then they should have chosen race, but they didn't on these tests.
But even some salient concepts to them. Gender, for example, is not necessarily stable in preschoolers. There's the classic work in which preschoolers believe that gender will change as a function of bodily appearance. Ask girls what happens when they cut their hair, for example.
Though there is, so the task we had where they did select gender and did reason that that was stable, and I know that Susan has some of her earlier work. If you show them, for instance, a boy and tell them that this boy has andro property in his blood, and then you show them other boys, that they also will infer that those children have the same property in their blood. So I think that around that age, maybe their concept of gender stability is not firmly rooted, but probably still nonetheless stronger than their concept of racial stability. Who knows what 4-year-olds are thinking, right?
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was curious about the role of the person who might be multiracial or biracial and the information they reveal about themselves, and just your thoughts. I don't know that your data spoke. I didn't see a condition where that actually was revealed. As an experimenter, you were telling people about the different conditions, but I was curious about your thoughts about this, because at the adult level, there's some interesting narratives that can be constructed about why someone like Barack Obama reminded us so many times, I have a mom from Kansas and a dad from Kenya. But what would that information do if it came from the person themselves in the who is this person going to grow up to be? How would that matter at all up to a young person in any of the age groups if the person said, I'm biracial, as opposed to just telling them information?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. And one, Obama's a unique case because he often does, portray himself he self-identifies as black, so that's why he's the first black person, because that's how he identifies. Now, we did run a version of the multiracial categorization task where we would show them multiracial people, and we would do this with 4-year-olds, and we'd say, for instance, this is Alicia, she calls herself black, or this is Alicia, she calls herself white, this is Alicia, she calls herself biracial. And parents weren't really happy with that language that we were using with that task, so we had to stop that study because they weren't happy. But we did think that how a person would self-identify would definitely switch around, that our concept of the person might align with how they self-identify. I don't have stuff on that with kids, but we do have work with adults where if we tell adults, let's say of a person named Michael, and we say that Michael enjoys certain activities that are more stereotypically one racial group over another, then they will use that information to categorize them in a certain way. So on the one hand, we do, that's where the whole stereotyping literature is, right? We use these categories to make inferences about the properties they have, but the reverse also holds that we'll use the properties to make inferences about the category you belong to. I don't know if anyone's looked at that with kids, but we tried, but yeah, I think that's an open question and a great one. Yeah.
So I just taught gender constancy today in class, and I actually teach that those classic findings are wrong, because if you do the studies the way that Susan does them, if you do just basic category-based induction, I like your version of it a little better, where it's slightly less stable in a 4-year-old because they'll still explicitly say that you can put a dress on a boy and he turns into a girl, you can cut a girl's hair and she turns into a boy. But if you do a category-based induction task, every 4-year-old will will draw inferences based on the actual category and not based on appearance, right?
My daughter didn't stop crying for a week when she was 4 when we cut her hair. And I finally explained to her, you're not going to turn into a boy, and then she was fine.
Well, that's a whole different story. So I want to, given the thing that you just said, though, I'm just trying to connect a little bit with that. The work on norms, which is a little more decontextualized at this point. You're not looking specifically at children's concepts of race and norms yet, but I'm assuming that's one of the directions that you want to go. So just the norm of what we call ourselves. Do you think you'd see consistency with your initial studies if you said to people, if you took the mixed race kid and you said she calls herself, this is just what you said, would they say it's okay or not okay? In other words, so I'm assuming that the white 5-year-olds would be fine with either because they don't seem to care one way or another. Would the black 5-year-olds be okay if she called herself white? Would they say that was not okay?
I don't know. So
I know you don't know, but I'm asking you.
So we do know that, for adults, for black and white adults, race is very political, and multiracial people really embody this, for many people, it's a politicized identity. So many black people want multiracials to identify as black in order to increase, black group membership and so on and so forth. And many white people want multiracials to categorize in a certain way for their own political ideologies. It's possible that a black child, if they learn of a multiracial person who identifies as white, that they see that as a rejection of their own identity and that they would believe that that's not okay. I'm not sure. It's likely that if they genuinely believe that a multiracial person is black and then they hear of a multiracial person who does not self-identify as such, in line with the latter study that I showed, I think I would predict that they would say that that's not okay because they're going against what they assume to be normative of that group, right?
Your identity also has to conform to group norms is basically your prediction.
I think so, yeah. But it's
interesting that itself could be a normative violation, that what you call yourself could be.
Yeah, so for instance, if I showed them a Hibble who called themselves a Glurk, that's a problem now, right? Especially if I'm a Hibble, maybe because now you're trying to infiltrate my group, or if I'm a Glurk because now you're leaving. That's a good question. I should test that. Yeah.
In the study where you find a very similar pattern of results between cooperation and competition, conditions, I wonder to what extent that's related to that the child being tested is not part of either of the groups, right? Because if you think about in the research and minimal group, once the competition is involved, and people are very, tend to view the other group very negatively and then trying to get resources to their own group and so forth. Those researchers are all they are involved as one of the groups, right?
Yeah.
But in your case, children are sort of third group,
party.
yeah, like observing. So I wonder if that probably play a role.
Yeah, no, I would definitely make the exact prediction. So if you think about, for instance, our big rivalry at Michigan Wolverines and the Ohio State Buckeyes. I'm a Wolverine. Now these two groups are in competition. Now if I learn of a Wolverine who's doing things more typical of an Ohio State Buckeye, well that's a huge problem, right? Because you belong to my group. So once our in-group membership comes online and under conditions of competition, then you would expect those biases to increase. And it's fascinating that even when the competition is removed and even when the in-group membership is removed, that disapproval still persists, right? That it's really easy to kick online, and it doesn't take a lot of other information to make it even worse, right?
I think that's it.
All right, thank you all.